You have joined the almost unbelievable YouTube channel with me, your host, Ranty. I really do appreciate you joining me. Now, today's video is a video about Jack the Ripper and essentially the top 5 suspects in the case. In other words, who was Jack the Ripper? Let's try and find out. It was a bitterly cold day on the 31st of December 1888, and a body was seen floating in the River Thames in London. Now, this body had been there for quite some time, and it was later identified to be that of Montague John Druitt. 31-year-old Montague John Druitt graduated from Oxford University in 1881, and he went on to become a teacher at Blackheath Boarding School. His tenure there didn't last very long, and he was dismissed from the boarding school for reasons that would probably not get somebody dismissed today. You see, he was seen as potentially being homosexual. After his dismissal, he later qualified as a solicitor. Now, it's about this time that both of his parents sadly passed away, and also at the same time, he had a mental health problem that continued to deteriorate. It's then that sadly he took his own life. So why is he suspected of being Jack the Ripper? Well, Melville Leslie McNaughton, who was the Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department from June 1888, had stated such many years after the events. In his autobiography, he states, "There can be no doubt that in the room at Miller's Court," referring clearly to Montague John Druitt, "the madman found ample scope for the opportunities he had all along been seeking, and the probability is that, after his awful glut on this occasion, his brain gave way altogether and he committed suicide. Otherwise, the murders would not have ceased." He is also quoted by the Daily Mail as saying that his biggest regret was that he joined the police force 6 months after Jack the Ripper had committed suicide. In a piece from that article, he goes on to say, "Of course, he was a maniac, but I have a very clear idea who he was and how he committed suicide. But that, with other secrets, will never be revealed by me. I have destroyed all my documents, and there is no record of the secret information which came into my possession at one time or another." Now, Melvin McNaughton went on to become Sir Melvin McNaughton, and it's clear that he had access to a lot of information at the time, and it's very clear to him who Jack the Ripper was. Will we ever get to find that documentation? Well, it's unlikely. He says it was all destroyed, but it's very clear at the time that he knew, or suspected he knew, who was the perpetrator. It's also interesting to note that his family, the family of Montague, also were adamant that he was Jack the Ripper. In New York, on the 27th of April in 1896, Carl Fagenbaum was put to death by electric chair. His crime? He had murdered an old lady in her home. He was a lodger at the premises at the time and had burst into the room and brutally murdered the lady as she lay in her bed. Unbeknownst to him, her son was also in the room at the same time and let out a holler and a scream and ran to go and find anybody that could come and help. The police promptly arrived and arrested him. Some 2 years later, he was put to death. Now, why is he linked to the Ripper case? Now, this all comes from his lawyer, William Sanford Lawton. The lawyer, who had been representing Carl Fagenbaum in this murder case, has gone on record to say that he believes that Carl Fagenbaum, who you have just seen put to death in the electric chair, can easily be connected with the Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel, London. He went on to say, "I will stake my professional reputation that if the police will trace this man's movements carefully for the last few years, their investigations will lead them to London and to Whitechapel." Now, can Mr. Lawton's suspicions be verified? And the simple answer to that is just a little bit. You see, Carl had arrived in London on the German merchant ship Rhea in the autumn of 1888. So he would have been in London and around Whitechapel in and around the time of the murders. Now then, does that mean that he is Jack the Ripper? Well, absolutely not. A lot of people lived in London at that time. However, it's been theorised that being a seaman and going to different locations in and around the world, he may have committed murders in different countries too, including Germany, Switzerland and the US. Now then, what's the difference between the Jack the Ripper murders and the murders committed in these other countries? Well, the difference is quite huge actually. You see, the murders there did not have any of the hallmarks of Jack the Ripper. In other words, they were killed differently and the demographics of the people were different too. So is it possible that he was Jack the Ripper? Just a little bit, but that's the only connection, is that he was in London at the time. That doesn't make him Jack the Ripper. December of 1884 saw the marriage of Elizabeth Weston Davis to one Francis Craig, and they were happy for the first 4 months or so of their married life. It was then that Francis found out that Elizabeth was actually working as a prostitute, and of course this changed everything. They stayed married for another couple of years, eventually divorcing in 1886 when Elizabeth fled and she moved to London, primarily in Whitechapel. It was there that she carried on working as a prostitute, and also at the same time she changed her name from Elizabeth Weston Davis to Mary Jane Kelly. Now, Mary Jane Kelly was in fact the last Ripper victim. So what makes people think that Francis was the Ripper? Well, it turns out that he moved to 306 Mile End Road, and it is believed that whilst he was there, he started to stalk her, and after witnessing her lifestyle, he became enraged and full of hatred. And it's also theorised that his hatred manifested itself into actually murdering Mary Jane Kelly. But he had to think of a way to get away with it. And how could he do that? Well, he could murder a few other victims prior to his main target, Mary Jane Kelly. Now, lots of people stalk their exes. This is a common phenomenon. Is that enough to say that he was Jack the Ripper based just upon that? And the answer is clearly no. But one thing is known for certain, and that is that in 1903, in Hammersmith, West London, he actually took his own life, and he did so by using a razor to his neck. He also left a note saying, "I have suffered a great deal of pain and agony," and that was left to his landlady at the time. Again, is that enough evidence? I don't think so, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. Mary Ann Nichols was the very first Jack the Ripper murder victim, and her body was found by Charles Cross and by Robert Paul. And both of these men had been on the way to work one early morning when they had seen the victim lying down in the street. They had both gone over to have a look, see what was going on. They had seen no visible injuries, no blood, anything like that. They weren't even sure if the victim was dead or alive, but they did know that if they stayed any longer they would be late for work, so they decided to leave and go and alert the first police officer that came their way. Around about 4 minutes later, the police were informed. The officer made his way to the victim, and it was there that it was determined that this was no longer just somebody lying in the street. This was actually a murder. You see, the police officer could see blood coming from the neck, checked the victim, and realised she had passed away. Both Robert and Charles voluntarily gave statements. However, what makes Charles a suspect in this? Well, he gave a false name at the scene. He gave his correct employer's details, and he gave the correct address with which he lived, but he gave the wrong name. You see, his name was Charles Latchmere, not Cross. And in Robert's statement, he had told police that he had been walking up the street when in the distance he could see a figure hovering over another figure on the floor. And as he walked and got closer and closer and closer, he could see that somebody had been kneeling down with the victim. And he wasn't sure what was going on, but he also got this strange feeling like he may have been attacked by whoever had been hovering over the body. And so he was a little unsure of the whole situation until Charles stood up and then beckoned him over to come and say, hey, there's somebody here that needs help. Now, what makes Charles a suspect in all this is the fact that Robert's report and Charles' report both say nothing about seeing any blood. And yet Robert had stated that it had been only about 4 minutes before he managed to contact the police, which meant that the police probably got there in 5 or 6 minutes. So the victim was on the floor, there was no blood visible to either Robert or Charles, and yet by the time the police got there, there was blood everywhere. It's suspicious to say the least, as is the fact he gave the wrong name. What also throws him in the hat for being Jack the Ripper is also the fact of where he worked and his route to work. You see, his route to work would have taken him past most of where the victims had been found. And also his mother lived in the Whitechapel area too, and she would have lived right next to other victims. So all very circumstantial, and yet his job at Pickford's Meats, where he would transport meats on a daily basis with his work attire potentially covered in blood, may have been the perfect disguise for somebody going around and murdering people. I've got Jack the Ripper's diary, said Mike Barrett in 1992. And the whole world listened to see whether or not this diary would actually finally unmask who Jack the Ripper was. You see, it was 1992, 2 electricians had been working on a property called Battle Creek House. Apparently this house had been owned by James Maybrick, who had been alive at the time of Jack the Ripper. He was a wealthy businessman from Liverpool. And in the diary, there are a lot of things written in that diary that the public just didn't have access to that information. Primarily information about how and what happened at the murder scenes and how these victims had died. So is it possible that they had actually found Jack the Ripper's diary? Well, it's hard to know for sure because testing on it has been inconclusive, and they were not able to determine whether or not it was a forgery or the real deal. There was also a pocket watch found at the same time as the diary, and it was also presented as evidence that this was from Jack the Ripper. Now, what makes people think that it was from Jack the Ripper? Well, it says so inside of the case. You see, it's inscribed with James Maybrick, I am Jack, and the initials of all of the Ripper victims. This watch was also put through an electron microscope to determine whether or not they could see whether it was a forgery or whether or not it's real to the time. In other words, were the inscriptions done at the time of Jack the Ripper or shortly after, or was it a very recent fake? And the only thing they could determine is that for sure these inscribings happened several tens of years ago. Several tens of years. What's that? 30, 40, 50? Who knows? But one thing's for sure, if it was a forgery, it wasn't a recent forgery. And that's really all I've got for you today. That's just 5 of the potential Ripper suspects. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you stay around for the next video, which will be released in another week's time. And I look forward to seeing you in that one too. Take care for now.